A new investigation from the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, or OCCRP, has revealed details of how two China-born fraudsters who tried to turn a radiation-soaked Pacific atoll into a future metropolis. The investigation reports the duo paid more than $1 million to UN diplomats to gain access to its headquarters before embarking on a controversial plan to set up an autonomous zone in the Pacific Ocean. Carrie Yan and Gina Zhou were sentenced by a US court earlier this year over a plot to bribe Marshall Islands politicians to create an autonomous zone 200 kilometers across open water from Kwajalein Atoll, where the US Army has a military facility. OCCRP reporters found the plan was the final step in a global grifting odyssey by the pair whose multi-million-dollar schemes included a miracle water cure and cryptocurrencies. Koroi Hawkins spoke with the lead Pacific editor at the OCCRP, Aubrey Balford, about the story.
So this investigation started last year, actually, when news broke that these two characters, Carrie Ann and Gina Zhou, had been extradited to the United States to face trial in New York for bribing Marshall Islands politicians to set up their special economic zone in Rongelap Atoll. And it was a story that got a fair bit of attention at the time, and it was a story that before that in the Marshall Islands had been very, very controversial and had really divided politics. But when we saw that they were being tried in the US, we thought, maybe there's something else behind this. So we just decided to start digging a little more. And once we started digging, things just got really, really interesting.
Yes, and reached right up into the upper echelons of the United Nations. Please talk us through some of that part of the story.
Yeah, so one of the first things we noticed about these guys is that as they were trying to carry out their plans in the Marshall Islands, that they were also claiming to have this affiliation with the United Nations. And, there were postings online from their organizations, from their, Twitter accounts and things like that, of them, posing in fairly official looking settings with, dignitaries and diplomats and sometimes politicians and leaders from countries around the world. We saw that they had this logo that made it look like, that they were affiliated with the UN. And so it was pretty clear that they'd managed to gain access, somehow into UN circles. So as we dug deeper and started looking into who they were talking to and reaching out to people and getting documents, what we found was basically that they'd paid their way in.
And are we expecting any, or have we seen already any charges being laid, arrests, anything in relation to those aspects of their activities?
So a lot of what we found hasn't really been reported before, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. But one of the really interesting things that we found is that they gained access to the UN using a bunch of, fixers and diplomats that they paid who have been caught up in other cases. So, there's basically three separate sets of other scandals that these people intersected with. So, to give one example, they managed to get access to the UN, get a photo opportunity with Ban Ki-moon by, paying to a shadow account run by Ugandan diplomats that were associated with the former president of the UN General Assembly, Sam Kutesa. Now, Sam Kutesa and his staff have been mixed up in another bribery case close to the UN. They also paid for access through a former Dominican Republic ambassador to the UN, Francis Lorenzo, who has also been mixed up in a UN corruption scandal, and at that very time was actually pleading guilty to charges in New York of bribery at the UN. And then we found that another person that facilitated their entry to the UN, a guy by the name of Frank Liu, is currently indicted in New York on charges of acting as an agent for China in the United States, harassing dissidents in the United States. So basically everywhere we went around this story, we found people mixed up in other criminal cases. And yet somehow these characters managed to slip through and really get themselves ensconced right in the heart of the halls of influence there at the UN.
Now, what's next for this story? I understand these individuals will be heading back to the Marshall Islands. Are there concerns?
So one of the things in the process of the reporting is Carrie Ann and Gina Zhou, it should be said, they're from China. They're from mainland China. But at some stage, they managed to get Marshall Islands passports. And when we spoke to Marshall Islands officials, including the former president, Hilda Heine, no one seemed to know actually how they got their Marshall Islands passports. But officially, they're Marshallese. So Gina Zhou was deported earlier this year, and she's already in Majuro. Carrie Yan, who was really the more senior member of this scheme, is due to finish up his prison sentence later this year and presumably will be deported to the Marshall Islands. So there is concern about what they can get up to next because they are citizens. They do have a track record of bribery and big schemes and scams. And Marshall Islands is, a country with just 40,000 people that does sit in a strategic position in the ocean, does have full sovereignty, stuff that it's quite easy or tempting to hijack. So yeah, there is a bit of concern about what could happen next.
Aubrey, always a pleasure, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.